Cliff Richard wasn't just a pop star, he was Britain's golden boy, the polished face of rock and roll with a voice that echoed through generations. But behind the dazzling smile and chart-topping hits was a man carrying a weight the world never saw. Rising to fame in the late 1950s, Cliff became a symbol of clean-cut success, his charm and talent turning him into a national treasure. Yet, for all the bright lights and sold-out arenas, there was a side of Cliff he kept hidden, a deeply personal truth that didn't fit the public image carefully crafted around him. Today, as he finally opens up, fans are left stunned by what he reveals, not just about his career, but about the battles he fought in silence while the world watched him shine. Behind the dazzling stage lights and carefully curated persona, Cliff Richard harbored a private world of struggles, sacrifice, and buried truths. And now, after decades of silence, he's finally ready to open the door to his past, and what he reveals is nothing short of astonishing. His story doesn't start with sold-out concerts or platinum records, but with a ship, the SS Ranch, cutting through the ocean in 1948, carrying families fleeing the fading British Empire. Among them was a young boy named Harry Roger Webb, born in 1940 in Lucknow, India, as bombs rained down during the chaos of World War II. Cliff's early life was anything but glamorous. It was marked by upheaval, war-torn skies, and the quiet confusion of a child uprooted from everything familiar. These early years of instability and displacement would shape the man behind the icon, forging resilience, but also creating wounds he wouldn't speak of for years. At just 8 years old, Harry Roger Webb, the boy who would one day become Cliff Richard, left behind the warmth and familiarity of India for a bleak and battered England still recovering from the horrors of World War II. The voyage to a better life aboard the SS Ranch landed his family in Cheshunt, Hertfordshire, where dreams were quickly replaced by harsh realities. Gone were the vibrant colors of his childhood, in their place stood grey skies, overcrowded housing, second-hand clothes, and the constant weight of ration cards. His father, Roger, took a modest job in a catering company, while his mother, Dorothy, struggled daily to hold the family together with what little they had. Life in post-war England offered no spotlight, just survival. And for Harry, the transition was brutal. His accent and appearance made him a target, ridiculed by classmates and forced to grow up fast. In a world that gave him every reason to shrink, he chose to stay quiet, endure, and wait for his moment to rise. During his early school years, the boy, who would later be referred to as the British Elvis, felt alienated. His escape was music. However, it wasn't a dream even then. It was kept a secret. Sometimes he would lock the bathroom door and sing along to the radio in a low voice. At 16, he received his first guitar. Nothing about it was new, not even close, but it unlocked something within of him. Harry began performing at church services and school functions, gradually raising his voice above the din of daily life. There was a change in these little performances. Harry felt visible for the first time as his classmates took notice. He had joined the Drifters, a local band, by 1957. In modest clubs, they performed early rock and roll and skiffle. It was a beginning, but it wasn't fame. He was bluntly informed by a talent manager a year later that Harry Webb wasn't a star's name. He needed a moniker that stuck if he wanted to be heard. Strong, sharp, and uncompromising, Cliff Richard also took a cue from Little Richard, his hero. Cliff Richard was born and Harry was gone in an instant. It was more than just a name that changed. Armor was the one. Beneath his polished stage act, the youngster was nevertheless a product of loneliness, poverty, and bereavement. But that would never be seen by the world. Cliff refused to let his feelings to get in the way of his work and erected a wall of discipline and control. Few people realized at the time that Cliff had developed the lifelong practice of concealing aspects of himself because of his early achievement. Cliff had completely assumed his new persona by the time Move It was broadcast on television in 1958. Raw, audacious, and unmistakably British, the song wasn't merely a smash. A cultural reset took place. It was not a copy of American rock and roll. It declared that Britain had a voice of its own. That voice belonged to a 17-year-old who had been just another immigrant boy wearing hand-me-down shoes just a few years prior. He became well known very immediately. His photo was plastered on the walls by teenagers. Newspapers proclaimed him to be Elvis Presley's replacement. But Cliff said nothing in the midst of the frenzy. He shook hands with people, sang into microphones, and grinned for the cameras. Behind the scenes, however, he maintained his composure, focus, and restraint. He didn't use fame carelessly. Because celebrity was brittle and Cliff was more aware than anyone of how quickly things could go wrong, he was methodical. Nevertheless, there was a feeling of mystery surrounding him even in his early years. He was neither the attractive flirt nor the bad boy rocker. He was more difficult to read. Cliff was a master at maintaining the spotlight while preventing it from penetrating too deeply into the areas of his life that he preferred to remain hidden. And that's the real beginning of his story. He brought memories, losses, and unsaid truths to the stage with a youngster who brought more than just a guitar. A fresh sound and the birth of Cliff Richard. Harry Webb had evolved from a young man with a guitar by the year 1958. He stood on the brink of something enormous. It was more than just an image change. Identity was at issue. Cliff was no longer playing in church basements or school hallways. He appeared in the tabloids, on national television, and on the radio. Girls rushed after his tour bus, fainted in groups, and chanted his name. The British music world had never witnessed such a level of insanity before. A complete and utter cultural phenomena. Newspapers began referring to the turmoil that followed him everywhere he went as Cliff Mania. However, Cliff became increasingly cautious behind the scenes as his public persona grew. He knew instinctively how hazardous it could be to lose control of his story because fame had come too quickly. He wore sharp suits, kept a tidy appearance, and hardly ever displayed weakness in interviews. Few fans ever got to see behind the scenes, but they were familiar with the smile, the melodies, and the charisma. At the time, people appreciated Cliff's decision to keep his private life private. He was supported throughout this quick ascent by his band, which is now known as the Shadows. They dominated the UK charts together and had a tight sound. Cliff remained at the top with songs like Living Doll, Traveling Light, and Please Don't Tease, frequently outselling American celebrities. He was more than just Britain's Elvis. He was larger for a while. Cliff actually outperformed Elvis Presley as the most popular male vocalist in a 1965 Global Fan Survey. He was selected to represent the UK at Eurovision that year, and his song, Congratulations, which is still one of his most well-known successes, helped him place second. Despite all of this accomplishment, Cliff never felt completely at ease. He was always calm but charming in interviews. He directed conversations back to his music when they veered into personal ground, which was rare. Cliff exuded discipline, in contrast to many of his peers who took great pleasure in disobedience. He abstained from excessive drinking, stayed out of trouble, and was never mentioned in gossip columns for his outrageous actions. The pressure was as genuine as that discipline. He never let the mask slip because he was aware of what the audience expected of him. Cliff was even characterized as protective by those close to him. Cliff maintained his composure as the other rock stars of the time went overboard. There was silence in his dressing room. Before shows, he prayed. He hardly ever dated in public. There were occasional rumors regarding his personal life, but Cliff always responded to inquiries with courtesy. Cliff appeared to be an exception at an era when being a pop star meant living a fast-paced, dazzling life. Calm, accurate, and under control. Beneath that poise, however, he was already starting to pay the price of celebrity. The strain to maintain the image, the smile, and the performance was beginning to mount. Fans didn't realize how much Cliff was already choosing to keep concealed, even if they thought they knew him from singing his songs, seeing his movies, and reading his interviews. He saw the vulnerability of public admiration. Cliff therefore took a different decision while his peers were having a raucous party. He made a living by avoiding certain aspects of himself. Not because he was ashamed, but rather because some things were too significant, too sensitive, or too difficult to discuss. Maybe never, but not then. He had discovered early on that he could be someone else on stage, someone self-assured, polished, and untouchable, and it worked. Cliff was a sensation. He was popular, youthful, and prosperous. But a portion of him stayed out of reach despite the people roaring and the cameras flashing. Fame, religion, and a personal desire. Cliff had developed into more than just a #1 performer by the early 1960s. He represented British pop. He influenced a generation of musicians with one success after another. However, Cliff's celebrity was never limited to headlines and applause. He wouldn't go over that line. He kept a portion of himself hidden on purpose. Songs like Bachelor Boy, Summer Holiday, and The Young Ones weren't only huge hits. They turned into pillars of the culture. Few could equal the pace at which he recorded recordings, toured the world, and acted in movies. His music was passionate, infectious, family-friendly, and exuded a clean, new vitality. Cliff distinguished himself from the untamed rock stars of the time. He maintained a pristine image while others dabbled in controversy and self-destruction. It was not a staged photograph. Cliff was truly exact, considerate, and disciplined. But he felt more alone the more people complimented him on his poise and composure. He knew how to be liked, but he didn't know how to be known. He always responded to questions about marriage or relationships in interviews with a smile, a joke, or a deft sidestep. Supporters conjectured. Despite repeated inquiries, Cliff never provided the media with any concrete answers. He then took a choice that stunned the business in 1966. Cliff openly professed his faith as a Christian when standing on stage at a Christian outreach event featuring American preacher Billy Graham. "I'm in show business for more reasons than just wanting to be well-known and wealthy. I do it now because my name is Cliff Richard, which allows me to serve God and do things like this." There was no publicity stunt involved. It was not practiced. Cliff was speaking from the heart. But it was a game changer. No British music celebrity at the time had ever publicly expressed such a strong religious opinion. It was shocking, even frightening, to a lot of music professionals and fans. Cliff was rumored to be about to give up music and focus entirely on the church. Record executives were in a frenzy. Others muttered that he had outlived his prime. Cliff, however, persisted. Rather, he made some adjustments in private. He briefly removed himself from the limelight. Reassessed his priorities and came back a clearer person, not a different one. He began singing with greater control and less flamboyance, and he began selecting songs with deeper significance. He stopped chasing hits as other people did. He was now anchored by something else. Faith wasn't a side trip for Cliff. It served as a base. He did not lose his audience as a result of this change. Actually, a lot of fans appreciated his candor. But that made the mystery surrounding him more complex. Even while Cliff was still the cheerful, vivacious icon, he had changed into a person with strong convictions, a respect for privacy, and the ability to not be everything to everyone. And even for those who were close to him, that made him more difficult to reach. Journalists kept asking why Cliff never got married over the years. It was a topic that never came up directly and always lingered in the background. Cliff was unaffected by the fast-paced relationships, dramatic breakups, and scandalous headlines that are common in this industry. In interviews and songs, he frequently discussed love, although he never specifically mentioned any one person. As the years went by, people began to ask out of perplexity rather than curiosity. But nobody knew at the time. He never mentioned her name or talked about her in interviews. He had his sights set on someone who was always just a hair's breadth away. Additionally, he had made the decision to conceal that story from newspapers, interested admirers, and even people who could have understood. The music of Cliff changed once again during the 1970s and 1980s. Hits like Devil Woman and We Don't Talk Anymore demonstrated his ability to change styles without compromising his morals. He was flourishing in the field, not simply making it through. Critics and other artists commended his longevity decade after decade. Cliff didn't receive enough credit for his ability to adapt to the ever-changing music industry, according to Eric Clapton. His work ethic was respected by Jimmy Page. He was regarded by even younger celebrities as a person of calm fortitude. The love that is hidden. Cliff never gave a public explanation for his decision to never get married for decades. Fans pondered, journalists conjectured, and friends occasionally gave hazy clues. However, Cliff consistently maintained his composure and responded to inquiries with a kind chuckle or a deft change of topic. He had his reasons, but he kept them secret. Most people knew the name at the center of that stillness, but few ever suspected it. Olivia Newton-John was just starting to gain popularity in the music industry when Cliff first met her in the early 1970s. She possessed the same warmth, charisma, and inherent radiance that made Cliff so lovable. The two had a clear chemistry in addition to sharing a stage. They encouraged one another's vocations, sang together, and laughed readily. It was a genuine and profound friendship. For Cliff, at least, there was more to it. Many people were unaware that Cliff had fallen in love with her in a quiet way, not in the dramatic fashion of a storybook, but rather in that slow, quiet kind of love that lingers over time. Olivia was unaware of its full extent, and he never made it public. Because it was already too late when Cliff became aware of how intensely he felt. In the background, Cliff's close buddy and guitarist Bruce Welch had been Olivia's fiancé. Just that made things more difficult. They would never be separated by Cliff. Olivia went on to marry someone else even after that romance ended. Even yet, Cliff kept a polite distance from her. He never went too far. He never told her anything that would make her life more difficult. Year after year, he just carried the emotion with him. Cliff and Olivia's paths kept coming together as their careers took off. They performed together, went to events together, and complimented each other in interviews. However, it was consistently presented as a friendship. And that was all it seemed to be in public. Nevertheless, anyone who seen them performing together sensed something more. It wasn't necessary to express the ease, the gentle compassion, and the understanding that existed between them. Cliff was still single. Even though Olivia created her own life, their relationship remained solid and unwavering over time. When Cliff became 75 in 2015, Olivia joined him for a duet at some point of his birthday live performance. They sang as if no time had exceeded, voices flawlessly in sync, eyes packed with emotion. Neither of them spoke aloud. Then in 2022 got here the news Cliff had continually dreaded, however in no way absolutely prepared for. Olivia had handed away after a protracted battle with most cancers. She died peacefully, surrounded through loved ones, and Cliff, heartbreakingly, turned into some of the remaining human beings to see her. In interviews in a while, Cliff's grief was quiet, but deep. He defined her loss of life no longer as a loss, however as her just stopping dwelling. It changed into clean for everyone paying attention that Olivia intended extra to him than he had ever admitted. While he spoke about her, the carefully composed Cliff Richard cracked just a little. The emotion in his voice didn't want clarification. And sooner or later, years after her passing, Cliff began to open up approximately it. He failed to body it as remorse, and he failed to blame timing or situation, however he admitted that he had loved her, that the love he had carried for her had stayed with him through many years of performances, interviews, and lonely in rooms. That he had never married because in some quiet part of himself he had already observed the person that held his heart. He stated it without bitterness. There has been no resentment, no what-if fable, only a quiet acknowledgement of something real that had in no way been spoken. And that silence, it turns out, had shaped an awful lot of his lifestyles. He had poured that unspoken love into song, into faith, into discipline. It wasn't just Olivia's absence that shaped him. It became the presence of a love that had nowhere to go. But even greater lately, he discovered something stunning. The instant that shattered his silence. For all the quiet grief Cliff had carried in his coronary heart, nothing prepared him for the storm that hit in 2014. A storm that would shake his international. It turned into public, relentless, and unforgiving. Cliff Richard eventually opens up on what he stored hidden for years, leaving fans taken aback. "I'm revealing the whole thing about that dreadful day. It's time for everybody to understand." That summertime, Cliff's home was rated stay on camera. The event changed into broadcast by the BBC in partnership with South Yorkshire Police, who had released an research based on a single allegation from a man claiming an incident decades earlier at a 1985 Billy Graham event. The accusation was severe, but from the beginning, it lacked evidence. Nonetheless, the police and the BBC struck a secret deal for exceptional get-right of entry to the raid, capturing each moment in what the BBC known as their money shot. The world watched as cops searched Cliff's home, a scene broadcast repeatedly on TV and online. The instant turned into humiliating for a person who had spent his complete career carefully shielding his privateness. The invasion became brutal. No prices were ever filed. The declare was subsequently debunked as fake and illogical, but the damage had already been achieved. Cliff's recognition became publicly stained. Headlines screamed. Fanatics and strangers alike have been forced to grapple with questions nobody wanted to ask. Cliff himself became left shattered. At the back of closed doors, the toll changed into extreme. He developed shingles, a painful viral situation induced by means of pressure. Depression took keep. He misplaced weight and struggled with insomnia. For months, he could not feature properly. The man who had constantly been visible as composed, disciplined, and sturdy was breaking. The investigation dragged on for almost 2 years, costing greater than $800,000 of public funds. Notwithstanding the lack of evidence, the accuser persisted to be dealt with as credible. Worse still, a person later tried to blackmail Cliff, exploiting the general public drama for his very own gain. In 2018, Cliff fought returned legally. He received a landmark privateness case towards the BBC, which the court docket condemned for sensationalist and irresponsible conduct. The ruling led to modifications in UK media regulation, tightening guidelines on how police investigations can be mentioned. But the victory came too fast to undo the damage. Now, years later, Cliff sooner or later opened up approximately what he kept hidden all those years. The deep emotional scars left by the fake allegations and the relentless media coverage. He talked about nights spent looking at the ceiling, suffering to breathe, to sleep, to locate peace, of feeling trapped, misunderstood, and on my own. And perhaps maximum surprising of all, Cliff found out that for a long term after the raid, he critically considered taking walks away from Toon altogether. The career he had devoted his existence to, the ardor that had fueled him from the start all of a sudden felt like a burden too heavy to hold. However, he didn't quit. As an alternative, he leaned on his religion. The identical faith he had embraced decades in advance. It gave him the power to stand the darkest days. It reminded him who he was past headlines and rumors, and it helped him find a way back to the stage, to the lovers, to the track. Rebuilding, reflection, and the road in advance. The fallout from the 2014 raid lingered lengthy after the cameras stopped rolling. For Cliff, existence became no longer just about making a song or performing. It had become approximately reclaiming his identification and healing wounds that the public couldn't see, however felt deeply. The criminal victory towards the BBC in 2018 changed into a landmark second. The court condemned the broadcaster's sensationalist processes and showed that Cliff's privateness were violated. This example compelled changes in UK media law, making it tougher for police and the clique to broadcast suspects' identities earlier than prices are proven. Yet, in spite of this win, Cliff said the damage became everlasting, no longer simply to his popularity, however to his spirit. Enthusiasts who had stood by using him quietly for years have become more vocal of their help after the truth got here out. Social media is filled with messages reminding the world that Cliff became extra than headlines. A person whose music had shaped lives for generations. Many expressed remorse over the public trial by means of media he had endured and praised his courage in eventually speak me brazenly about his revel in. Cliff himself adopted a brand new outlook. He recounted that his ordeal had forced him to sluggish down and replicate deeply on what mattered most. The relentless tempo of the song industry, the strain to hold a really perfect photograph, it all gave way to a quieter life focused on recuperation and faith. He remains unmarried and maintains to live modestly, choosing peace over exposure. His concerts, even as fewer, nevertheless attract unswerving lovers who recognize the honesty and heat he now brings to the stage. He sings now not for repute or charts, however, because track is a part of who he's, a manner to connect, to express, and to discover solace. Looking again, Cliff says he regrets not anything about his existence's journey, the successes, the heartbreak, or maybe the hardships. Every chapter formed him. But now, for the first time, he welcomes being fully visible, now not as a really perfect icon, but as a real person with scars, testimonies, and feelings. He has all started to share extra overtly approximately his past, which include the many years-long love he quietly carried for Olivia Newton-John, the ache of dropping her, and the deep wounds left by way of the fake allegations. It's a vulnerability fans hadn't visible before, and it has brought them nearer than ever. Cliff's tale is a reminder that fame can cover extra than it exhibits and that sometimes the hardest battles are fought in silence. Now that the silence has been damaged, he's eventually loose to be himself. Not just the famous person thousands and thousands adore, but the man who lived the lifestyles of love, loss, faith, and resilience. Might you have stored the secrets and techniques in case you had been in Cliff's shoes? Let us recognize within the comments.